learn the basic stitches that we need for this project, we are going to be creating a mini project called a sampler. Now, a sampler is when you practice a variety of stitches onto a piece of work, but in order to make this a slightly more sustainable project, we're going to be turning our sampler stitching piece of felt into a pen pouch or pencil pouch, whatever you want to put in it. So essentially what we're going to be doing with this rectangular piece of felt that's got a square cut out of the top corner is we're going to be bringing the side of the felt across. We're going to be joining it with some stitching along the edge. We're going to be using this as a flap to come down, and there will be a button that closes the pencil pouch even, when we've put our pencils inside. So as you can see, we're going to make a very long, thin pencil case here, and this is what it's going to look like. So along this front side of your pen pouch, we're going to have 3 different stitches that we're going to be using within this project. We're going to have a special stitch that we use to join the 2 pieces of fabric together. And we're going to learn how to sew on a button, because buttons are an integral part of our design. Okay, so I've just drawn a little plan of what my sampler is going to look like. Okay, very rough plan just to get it clear in my head. So when my pen pouch is closed and the button is securing it, I'm going to have 3 rows of stitching on that front side. They are going to have to be quite close together because my pen pouch is very narrow. I've got my button, and I haven't drawn it on here, but we are going to have a stitch that goes around the outside that will link it all up together. So the first thing I need to do is make sure that I've got the right side of my felt showing. I need to work out which side I need to sew on. So as you can see, I've got my felt like this, and I'm going to call it the chimney because that's what it reminds me of. I've got the chimney on the right hand side, and I know that when I fold over the shorter side of the pen pouch, then I can bring that chimney down over the top. So I know that this is the side that I'm going to be sewing on. So what I'm going to do is that I now know that this is the inside of my felt. And I'm just going to use my handwriting pen, and I'm just going to do a little X in the middle, so I know that I'm not sewing on this side of my felt. So it would be a good idea if you could mark the wrong side of your felt with an X. So you're showing that you've got your chimney on the right hand side, you're folding over your felt and bringing down that flap. This is the side that we are sewing onto. So all of this is the inside. We're marking it with an X. So what I've drawn on my plan is that I'm going to have to turn over my felt so that the chimney is now on the left hand side. And I can see that I'm going to be sewing along here. Okay, I've also added my initial there because it would be quite nice to add an initial to our work, so we know whose pencil pouch is whose. Okay, so I'm just going to fold it up one more time, just so I can get an idea of where I need to sew things. Okay, I'm just looking for what I might do is do a very small dot with my pen. This will show up on your final piece. It has to be very small if you're going to do this, but I'm just going to put a tiny dot to show that that's where the flap of my pen pouch comes down to. That means I probably want about a quarter of the space that's left for my initial. So I'm going to be doing my 3 rows of stitches about here. Okay, they don't need to be long rows of stitching. Okay, I also need to make sure that I'm leaving room at the edge for the stitch that we're doing last. Okay, Right, the next part of what we're doing, just trying to get myself organised and make sure I'm not going to do anything wrong, is we are going to start with a running stitch. Okay, so I'm going to take my needle off my magnet to make sure my magnet's back on my table. I've got my threaded needle with my knot in the end and a long tail here so my needle doesn't keep falling off. And I'm going to turn my felt around this way. So I know that I'm sewing along this piece here. And I'm going to start, I know that I want my stitches to start about here. And I'm going to leave about 1 centimetre. I'm going to bring my needle behind my piece of felt. I'm using my thumb as a guide, but be careful that you're not going to poke your thumb with your needle. And I'm just going to bring it through that first part of my sewing to show where I'm going to start. Okay, now it's up to you how you want to hold your felt while you are sewing. I will show you how I do it, but it's all personal preference. So we're sewing from here to here, and I like to sew from right to left because I'm right-handed. You might find you go the opposite direction if you are left-handed. So just turn it round whichever way suits you. Doesn't matter that this piece is quite long at the back, we can trim that off at the end. So the first stitch we're going to do is running stitch. I want all of my stitches to be quite an even size. So I'm going to show you a little trick that I use to make sure that my stitches are an even size. It's a great excuse for drawing on your hands in school. Okay, so on my thumb, I'm going to make 2 little lines. Okay, and that's roughly how long I want my stitch to be. And by having it on my thumb, I'm going to have that while I'm holding my work. I can use it to check that my stitches are roughly that sort of size. So running stitch, we've got our thread coming from the back towards the front, and I'm just going to be sewing in a straight line using this as my guide. So I want it to be about here. And I'm going to put my needle back into the felt. I'm going to slowly, and it's really important we do it slowly, bring my thread, pull my thread tight, but not too tight. I'm pulling it so it lies flat on my fabric. If I pull it any tighter, it's going to bend my fabric up and crumple it, and that's not going to be a very good end result. Okay, so with the running stitch, you want to come back out from underneath the felt the same distance away. So I'm using my thumb guide here, and I'm going to bring, doesn't matter. What I find is I usually poke my needle through quite a few times until I get to the right place, trying to make sure I'm in a straight line. I'm happy with that. It's about the right length of stitch. And then I'm going to bring my thread slowly through. And I'm going to keep repeating that. Still trying to keep them the same width. Okay, so we have a stitch, a gap, a stitch, we'll have another gap, and you're going to carry on until you get to the end of the pencil pouch. So I'm going to continue that now and stop talking. You can pause the video until you've all got to that point. You also, just one final note, you want to make sure that you're not going too close to this edge because we're going to be sewing along that edge as well. So when you're finished, you don't need to tie a knot or do anything else. I've gone slightly wonky with my line, but it's not the end of the world. And you're going to put your needle down until everyone's at the same point, and then we'll move on to the next instruction. So the next stitch that I'm going to do is called a back stitch. And as you can see from my diagram here, this has been my running stitch, and I'm going to do my back stitch along this side here. I need to make sure I leave enough space for my cross stitches in the middle. But the reason I'm doing the back stitch next is because it's the next hardest stitch, and it also will leave me a nice channel for my cross stitch. So I'm going to just fold over my pen pouch just to check how I'm doing for space. Now I can go quite close to the edge with this one because I'm not going to be putting my blanket stitch around this side. Okay, so actually what I'm going to do, I haven't tied a knot or started another piece of thread because I've got plenty on my needle. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring my needle out roughly where I want it to be. So if I just show you here, I'm quite happy with that. It's just coming out across the other side. I'm leaving a channel down the middle, and I'm not pulling it too tight because if I pull it too tight, it's all going to pucker up. If that does happen, just pull it out flat again, and that will relieve the tension on your stitches. Okay. So the back stitch is a little bit different to running stitch. The final appearance of your back stitch is similar to the running stitch. However, you don't have the gaps in between each stitch. Now it's quite handy actually that when I folded over my pencil pouch and I've just pressed my fingers along the edge, I've got a nice line showing me where the center line is. So I'm going to just do my row of stitching just above there. So I am going to start off by doing a running stitch. Just one simple stitch, using my thumb as that guide again to try and keep them nice and even. Okay, now this is where we do things a little bit differently. Again, I'm going to bring my needle out the same length away from my first stitch. Bring that through nice and slowly. And instead of going forwards like I would do with a running stitch, I'm going to go back, which is why it's called a back stitch, and I'm going to go into the hole where I came out with my stitch before. So I should be able to ease my needle in there. Okay, and now I've got two stitches really nice and closely together. If you tried to do this like a running stitch without leaving a gap, you'd probably end up pulling the thread back through and your stitch would come loose. So this time I'm bringing my needle out one space ahead of where my last stitch ended. Okay, pull my thread through and go back to where that stitch ends. So as you can see, we get this lovely neat line. Come out where your next stitch should go, back into the end of the last one. So you can pause the video. I'm going to carry on until I get to the end of this row. I'm going to stop when I get to this point here. Okay, so once I've finished that row of stitching, again, I can see I've gone a little bit wonky here. It's not the end of the world. I'm going to be doing what's called a cross stitch down the middle. Now I think I've got enough thread to get to the end here. It might be a little bit tight, but just keep going if you've got a decent amount of thread, usually about double the length that you need to sew down. So I'm making sure I've got the right side of my work facing me. So that means the side that has the stitches that I want to see. This is the right side and this is called the wrong side. So your wrong side, if you see, the running stitch looks exactly the same on the wrong side as it does on the right side. But the back stitch, you can see where you go backwards and overlap a little bit. So it's quite a strong stitch, the back stitch. Okay, so I'm going to be going down the middle, just like I've got on my plan, with some X's. Now I'm going to just put my needle into the middle of this space. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a diagonal line. So what I've done is I've come out at this end of one of the stitches and I've gone back in at the opposite end of another stitch in a diagonal line. And then what I need to do is I need to bring my needle up here. Okay, so I've brought my needle up on the other part of the X, bring it through, and I'm going to be going back in. You can see I'm making an X here. I'm going to go back in underneath this stitch and in line with this one here. Okay, so there I have got a really nice simple little X, and I'm going to try and do it in the same order each time. So if I show you on my piece of paper, so I've started here at number 1 and I bring my thread across to number 2, and then I've come out at number 3 and I finish at number 4. So I go from bottom left to top right, and then I come out at top left and go to bottom right. Doesn't matter if you get your order mixed up. I just find it useful to try and do it the same way, because then you can get into a rhythm with your sewing. So I'm going to leave my stitch gap in between here, and I'm coming out at this bottom corner. Okay, and then I know I'm going to go not up here, I'm going to go 1 stitch across but diagonally, bringing my needle down. Oh, I can see, look, my thread is a little bit close to the end here, so I'm just going to pull some through so I don't lose it. This can happen when you are working with just a short piece of thread. I'm going to come back up at point number 3 and then back down. I can always just lay my thread across to see where it is I need to go and go back in like that. So leave a gap in at the bottom corner, up to the next one. Okay, now I haven't quite got enough thread on my needle, so I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. It's always a bit of a faff when you're so close to the end of your project or the thing that you're doing and you haven't got a lot of thread. Okay, at this point I need to tie a knot, and I need to start with another piece of thread, which is very annoying because I've only got 3 stitches left to do. But if I work too close to the end of my thread, I'm not going to be able to tie a knot at the end. What I'm going to do, because I know my back stitch is a very strong piece of stitching, I'm going to thread my needle underneath those threads there, okay? And I'm going to loop round. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make a knot around another strong stitch. So you can see I've made a loop here just by going under these back stitches, around and back under. And what I want to do is I want to poke my needle through this loop, okay, and then I usually hold my work down flat, and I'm going to pull it, and can you see it tightening around that stitch? I can use my fingers just to pull it tight again, just hold it in place and just tug gently, okay? And that is a knot that's going to keep my work secure. So I'll show you one more time because I like to double knot things. I'm going underneath these stitches, which makes a loop. Then I'm putting my needle through the loop, and I'm just doing it so slowly and tug, tug, tug. That should be nice and secure now. So I can use my scissors and I can just snip away at the edge there. So then I'd need to thread my needle again to carry on. But you can see how I've started to use cross stitch along this point. Hopefully you'll get to the end of your cross stitch before you need to change thread. So I'm going to pause the video while I rethread my needle, and I will meet you back ready for sewing our initials.